In the last segment of the course, we finished up on respiration, getting oxygen from the environment into some sort of respiratory organ, whether it be gills or lungs. And we saw how ventilation is used to make sure that fresh oxygenated fluid is constantly brought into contact with those respiratory organs. And we also saw that there is some kind of diffusion surface where the surface area of the surface is maximized to maximize the amount of diffusion. We saw different ways that vertebrates have of making sure that their blood gets fully saturated with oxygen. So now we're going to turn our attention to what's going to happen with that blood at this point. Where is that blood going to go? How is it going to make sure that these materials, whether it be oxygen or nutrients, reach every single cell in the body? And we're going to begin our discussion of the circulatory system by looking at the different kinds of blood vessels and the different characteristics of the different kinds of blood vessels. And so why are we starting out talking about blood vessels? So in the start of this whole unit on material transport, we said that with large body size, what you really need is a combination of bulk flow, movement of large quantities of fluids combined with the diffusion system, because remember, diffusion is always the way that materials actually enter cells. And so the blood vessels really have a major role in facilitating this combined system of bulk flow and diffusion. So what you really need to do is make sure that you've got fast flow speeds to deliver large quantities of blood to the cells that need them. So you need to get the materials there efficiently and quickly, but then once you get to the diffusion surface, you need to really slow down this flow speed to make sure that there's a maximal amount of time to transfer those materials at the diffusion surface. So you need to have some mechanism for fast transport, but then slowing this fluid, slowing this blood way down so that the maximum amount of material can be transferred from the blood to the cells when you get to the diffusion surface. And it turns out that the different kinds of blood vessels that we find in the circulatory system, it's composed of vessels of different sizes that are going to transport blood at different speeds and under different amounts of pressure. So let's take a look at how that works. We're going to start with arteries. So these are defined as vessels that move blood away from the heart. So the definition of arteries has nothing to do with whether the blood in them is oxygenated or deoxygenated, but they're always going to be transporting blood away from the heart. So arteries are characterized by having very thick muscular walls. So when you feel your pulse in your wrist, basically you're feeling the smooth muscles of those arteries pulsating and helping to move that blood through. As we see here, the artery is lined by an epithelium. Remember from your intro bio courses that an epithelium is a sheet of cells that are closely connected to each other, all packed together into a sheet. And so the very innermost lining is an endothelium. We call it an endothelium when it lines the inside of some kind of structure. Then there's a thin elastic layer, and then a very, very thick layer of muscle, surrounded again by another thin elastic layer, and then finally connective tissue. So these are going to be specialized for carrying blood under high pressure. Going down to the next smaller level, after we go through the arteries, they're going to break up into smaller arteries called arterioles, and then finally the very, very smallest vessels known as capillaries. So capillaries have only an epithelial layer around them, one cell layer thick, and they have a very small diameter so that one red blood cell at a time moves through. So they move through these capillaries in single file, again minimizing that distance for diffusion. So capillaries are going to be where the diffusion actually happens. After the blood goes through a capillary bed, they're then going to enter venules and then veins. So venules are basically just small veins that are going to join together to form the larger veins. So veins have thin walls, not very muscular, just a very, very small layer of smooth muscle around them, and they're going to be carrying blood under very low pressure. So the veins are defined as vessels that carry blood back toward the heart. And so if this blood is under low pressure, how do we maintain this flow back toward the heart? It turns out that the structure of the veins is such that it's equipped with these little valves every so often, and they're positioned between skeletal muscles. So these skeletal muscles squeeze the vein. So when they do that, they're going to make the blood inside move. But obviously the blood is going to not move in any particular direction. It's just going to move away from that squeeze in both directions. But what happens is the pressure caused by the blood in the direction, in the retrograde direction toward these valves, is going to push on those valves and push them shut. And so once those valves shut, then the blood is going to change its direction back upward toward the heart and move through these valves, because the blood is going to be pushing on this valve in a way that allows it to open and move through. And in this way, the blood keeps moving back toward the heart. So this is the reason why, for example, when you're bedridden, you need to make sure you keep working your muscles, moving your legs around to make sure that blood doesn't pool up in your venous system. Also on airplanes, when you're sitting for a long time, you want to make sure that you're working those muscles and moving your legs around so that you don't get blood pooling up. So in this way, the blood moves back to the heart even against gravity. Even if you're standing and gravity is pulling the blood down toward your feet, this system keeps it moving back up toward your heart. So now let's see how this arrangement of different sizes and different branching patterns of these vessels meet this goal of having different speeds to allow this bulk flow at fast speed and then diffusion at very slow speed. And to begin to understand this, we're going to look at the physical principle called the law of continuity. And the easiest way to understand the law of continuity is to think about a closed pipe system, a section of pipe. And we want to think about a pipe that at some point gets larger in diameter. So there's fluid moving through this pipe. We've got fluid moving in from this direction, moving out in the other direction. Because the fluid can't change density, at least at physiological speeds, the amount of fluid that flows into this section of pipe per unit time has to exactly equal the amount of fluid, the volume of fluid that's flowing out the other end of the pipe in that same unit of time. So the volume flow rate, the amount of fluid that's flowing into that section of pipe in a given period of time, is going to be equal to the area of the opening times the velocity. So if you think of that in terms of units, a volume flow rate is going to be in units of meters cubed per second. So meters cubed is a volume per unit time. The area is going to be in meters squared times meters per second. That's the velocity. So you end up with the same units. This is going to equal the volume flow rate, the area of the opening times the velocity of the fluid going through. So because of this law of continuity, because there's not going to be any increase or decrease in the density of the fluid in that pipe, the same amount needs to come out as goes in a certain period of time. So the volume flow rate in has to always equal the volume flow rate out because of this constant density. What goes in, what must come out in any given period of time. So using this definition of the volume flow rate, what that gives us is that the area in times the velocity in equals the area out times the velocity out. So what this means is that this end where there's a low area, there's going to be a relatively high velocity. And this end here where there's a relatively large area, it's going to have to be a low velocity to keep this equation equal. So smaller cross-sectional area is going to be faster speed, larger cross-sectional area is going to be a slower speed. So what does this have to do with circulatory systems? So when we think of the branching of these different vessels, what we have is a situation that's more like this. We've got a large vessel that's going to branch and branch and branch and branch into many smaller. So we still have a situation where the volume flow rate, this is still a closed system, so the volume flow rate coming in through this larger pipe is going to need to equal the volume flow rate coming out the other ends. And so in this case, it's going to be the volume flow rate coming in, and then the sum of the volume flow rate coming through all of these little branches. So that means that this area that we use for the volume flow rate coming out is going to be the sum of the cross-sectional areas of all of these little branches, all of these little pipes. So the area in times the velocity in is going to equal the sum of all the areas coming out times the velocity coming out. If you break down into a lot of small branches, many, the way we see in a circulatory system, this is going to end up having a very large combined cross-sectional area relative to the cross-sectional area of this input vessel. So this is going to have a relatively low cross-sectional area and a high velocity in these larger vessels like the arteries, and a relatively large area if you combine and add together all the cross-sectional areas of these smaller vessels to have a relatively low velocity. And we see this if we actually measure the velocity in different vessels. In this case, this is data from a dog. We see in the aorta, which is the largest artery in the mammalian body, we've got a very relatively high velocity, 40 centimeters per second. Gets lower and lower as we get down into the arteries and arterioles, and finally down in the capillaries, we've got a very slow velocity. So bulk flow at a high speed, low speed down at this diffusion surface. It slows it way down, giving plenty of time for the exchange of materials, and then it starts to speed up somewhat as it goes into the venous system. But remember, if we look here in the middle at the pressure in these different vessels, the blood is under the highest pressure in the aorta. This is immediately after it's been pumped with the heart. And remember also that these vessels are offering a lot of resistance. So it's going to transmit that pressure from the heart and not dissipate it by allowing the vessels to expand. So this is going to be under very high pressure, decreasing pressure all the way down into the vena cava, which is the large vein that returns all the blood back to the heart. So this is going to be under very low pressure by the time it returns back to the heart to be repumped. Also notice here, if we look at the volume of blood that's carried in each of these kinds of vessels in a particular time, the veins have the largest blood volume. Remember that these vessels are highly elastic and can pool up blood by expanding. And so most of the blood at any given time is going to be contained in the venous system under very low pressure. So this is how the different vessels that we see in the circulatory system contribute to really making this combined bulk flow and diffusion system that we see in vertebrate circulatory systems work.